and we can actually begin our first session. And the first talk will be given by Dr. Eli Hurvitz. Eli Hurvitz is the Executive Director of the Trump Foundation and a member of the National Board of Education. He was nominated twice by The Marker magazine as one of Israel's 100 most influential people. His talk is entitled Education Under Siege: How the World's Education Systems Operated During the COVID-19 Closures. And his talk will outline some similarities and differences between several education systems, and will seek to explore the effects of public trust in teachers, their professionalism, and the level of school autonomy. Eli, the stage is yours. I will give you a note at the end of the talk 5 minutes before the end, so we can have time for discussion.
Thank you so much, Liat, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to talk to you today. I hope the technicalities will work out. Everybody in their opening remarks said that people here come from all corners of the world. I'm sitting now probably at the end of the world. At least there was an Academy Award movie about the place I'm sitting in now, called Turn Left at the End of the World. It's a very small development town down south in the Negev desert of Israel, where very surprisingly, a very nice accelerator of EdTech startups has emerged, and I hope that the connection will work out fine. I will try to share my screen, and let's see if this works out as well. There we go. Are we all set? So I will devote the coming few minutes to share with you a perspective of a philanthropic foundation operating in Israel about what happened around the world, what everybody has been looking at and trying to help and give a hand in the past few months. So take whatever I say with a grain of salt. It's just a perspective coming in from a remote place on Earth. But it may be valuable to your efforts as well, because Israel is a place that is quite accustomed to emergencies and crises. And this is a perspective that comes from sort of a collective experience. So let me start. The basic questions I would like to pose at the beginning and also at the end of my talk would be the following. And I think everybody knows that in times of trouble, our true priorities emerge. And when we look at education systems under siege or in lockdown, we have to prioritize our goals and prioritize our resources. And some answers emerge. Some of them are not very pleasant. The basic question is education a vital service? Hospitals maintained their work during lockdown, and in some countries, some portions of education is maintained, but the vast majority of schools closed their doors almost to everyone. The next question would be, why do we focus on exit tests and transitions? So when lockdowns became tiring and systems wanted to go back and operate, first priority in many countries was given to kids in 11th or 12th grade or at exit tests after middle school, and to the transitions between elementary and middle school, between middle school and high school. Why do we focus on exit and transition? The third question is why middle schools are always last. They're in the middle. That's the straightforward answer. But in some countries, middle schools will not operate at all until the next school year, whereas high school and elementary school already started in some portions of the world. The fourth question is, what is the purpose of K-4? I thought it was about teaching the essentials, the elementary, the basics, reading and writing, the 3 Rs. But in many countries, it was about providing parents the opportunity of coming back to work, and not about education whatsoever. At least in the Israeli press, we focused a lot about getting the kids in kindergarten and elementary grades back to school, and the sole purpose was not to get their reading and writing in place, but to get their parents back to work. And the last question, which is more important to this forum, is: do we genuinely trust our teachers? In Israel, it's not a secret that there was a big issue between teacher unions and government around the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a moment of decision. Physical doctors and nurses were by all means the heroes of this period, whereas teachers were less so. I would like to talk to you about a very specific period in this cycle of crisis. This period starts after the immediate shock of a pandemic, and after a while we are beginning to work out our emergency procedures. In some countries it started overnight. In Israel it was on a moment's notice. Other countries took the time until they locked down everything. And there is this period of time of emergency, and then the emergency routine, we call it in Israel. We accept the notion of living in a state of emergency for a while, but then there is fatigue. We get tired of being locked down at home. We become furious. We become nostalgic about the old routine that we want to go back to, although when we remember what it was, sometimes there is no straightforward reason why we become nostalgic about the old routine. But when we're tired about keeping ourselves in a state of emergency, we become pressured, and we pressure our leaders. In Israel, it was a very interesting case, because at this stage we changed our government from a transition temporary government to a national unity government. And at this moment, it was obvious to everyone that we need to open up our schools, and we need to revisit our grandparents, and we need to be happy, because otherwise we will notice that 1 million Israelis lost their jobs, and they will march the streets and pressure towards elections and changing our leaders. So it was obvious that our leaders will open everything almost with no restrictions. So I will be talking about this period between school lockdown that in Israel started in March 16, and school reopening that in Israel happened exactly 2 months afterwards. But in other countries, it took more. In Hong Kong, that I saw, that we'll be talking about later on, it was almost 4 months, I think. When we look at systems around the world, and for our purposes, it was very interesting to see what you see here that is quite familiar to probably all of you, this pendulum between centralized and decentralized systems. You see the DNA of systems emerging under these circumstances. Of course, every education system around the world is a mixture between the two. But for this methodological purpose, I'm using this chart. So you see education systems that use standardized curriculum and structures and data systems and monitoring and external motivation. These countries were, they had a tendency to start with top-down schedules, with educational television when the lockdown started. They put a focus on assessment of learning, to know, to control, and synchronous teaching using Zoom, for instance, was probably the primary vehicle to copy and paste the old or the regular way of transmitting teaching into learning. Whereas other countries that are more decentralized, that use personalized learning, they allow local management of school systems, they focus on child development, and they trust their teachers. So you see there also synchronous teaching, but then some focus on social and emotional learning, lots of focus on self-learning, not copying and pasting the online, the regular frontal teaching, and the programs were teacher-led rather than top-down. And in many countries you saw a mix. In Israel, which is probably a mix of both, we're centralized in Jerusalem and decentralized in every school. You saw a mix of all of these, but that was very interesting to see. In a survey that was conducted by OECD and Harvard recently, you saw some lessons learned in countries around the world until we get results from PISA 2021 that will probably be delayed like every other Olympic Games. So the only thing we have now is surveys, and you see that only 1,400 participants, teachers, school principals, administrators of education, so forth, from 59 countries participated in this survey. And what you can see that emerges from this period, from lockdown to reopening, is that administrators claim that it's not possible to assess whether students actually learned enough or at all, or at least what they were supposed to in comparison to the intended curriculum. Whereas teachers always know the truth, and they say, at least 50% of the teachers say that students learned less than in school. And it's a big, big issue for many countries, understanding that gaps have been widening between students and with students and the intended curriculum. The same survey, you could see teachers were asked what was the focus of the distance learning strategy. And by all means, they say almost 90% that educational continuity and academic learning was the primary focus. Then they said emotional needs of students. That's very different from what administrators said. They were focusing more on the assessment of learning. You can see the numbers there. So it was very much into creating opportunities for educational continuity. How are your schools reopening? Administrators noticed, well, it's a mix. Some of them come back to school by age or by grade level, as I said earlier. Some of them operate in shifts. Some use, and many will use in the coming few months, hybrid measures of school and home, sometimes on a moment's notice, moving from classroom-based teaching to home-based teaching. And some countries, Israel, for instance, return to normal immediately after collapsing with our shifts and capsules. When teachers were asked what are their plans for reopening, what are the arrangements that are included in order to assess and address what happened during the 2, 3, 4 months of lockdown, the first priority is on counseling for students. That's a big, big issue. They were also asked about whether there are enough counselors in their school, whether they have budgets to increase the scope of counseling, and the straightforward answer was no. Everybody is facing significant budget cuts, and that's a big issue. But the focus is on counseling for students. Then the assessments of the learning gaps that are worrying, the special supports to kids who come back from lockdowns and quarantine at home and suffered from home violence and from distress, a focus on disadvantaged students and on mental health. And as I said before, a very interesting focus on the transitions, mostly from middle school to high school and others. and on special needs. These are the plans that coming in from 59 countries around the world for their reopening. So just to sum up what I tried to present here is that when we look at various countries around the world, the period of lockdown and their plans for reopening, most of them towards the beginning of the next school year. The first priority is on the assessment of gaps, not on teaching and learning immediately, but on the understanding that the students who come back to school now are very different from the students who left them a few months ago. So the focus is mainly on personalized remediation to try to get as many kids back to track by working on programs and counseling. We see in many countries, in Israel, it's just mounting. There's a tendency to use the summer vacation, what's left of the summer vacation, because families are not vacating and not traveling, to focus on summer school and immersion programs, again, to help as many teachers go back to track with the intended curriculum. We see professional development for teachers on this new hybrid pedagogy of mixing between school-based and home-based learning, using online and sometimes self-learning, lots of LMS systems coming in order to help students and teachers conduct a smooth transition from home to school on a moment's notice. We see some restructuring of curriculum and sequence coming in. Some countries are minimizing the demands, starting from the exit tests, but also for next year's curriculum. And that's a very interesting phenomenon because learning and teaching time is decreasing. Some countries, Israel was not very good at it, are communicating with parents in order to inform them of what's going to happen in the coming few months, if they know. And as I said before, almost, if not all countries, understand that they will be facing significant budget cuts in education, as many social services will suffer. And under these circumstances and growing needs, teachers, again, will have to do miracles. So, getting back to the first slide where I pose these questions, and these questions are for everyone. Is education a vital service? Why do we focus on exit tests and transition? Why middle school are always last? What's the true purpose of K-4? And do we genuinely trust our teachers? Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your study day.
Thank you very much, Eli. And now Jay will present some of the questions that have been posted on the chat to you. Jay, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Eli. The first question I think that was asked that we'd like to get, it wasn't the first question, but can we get a link to the research so that people can check these things out by themselves? If you don't put it in
sure.
now, if you will get it, we'll be happy to put it in for the end of the study day.
Sure, of course. It's open. Andreas Schleicher and Professor Ramirez from Harvard did a very interesting talk around this topic using a very effective webinar system. I will share with you both the full research and the recording of the webinar afterwards.
Very good. Thank you very much. Anat asks, concerning the survey, which schools or grades were actually in the survey? I don't know whether she's also asking what types of schools, if these were public schools or private schools or what, but that's also a question that we'd like to know about. And the other question that's so far come up, Danya asks, the survey was directed toward administrators and toward teachers. Were there any surveys that were done about MOL students themselves?
Right. There were 2 or 3 questions here. So I'll start with the last. I think, as you see in many attempts that are going on now around the world, it's not as rigorous as we used to, because we are under difficult circumstances. I shared with you a survey that was conducted with very few participants, only 1,400 participants coming. Some of them are administrators, others are teachers, school principals, superintendents, instructors, and so forth. It's not representative, it's not sample-based, but this is what the world probably has to offer these days. I'm not sure that the coronavirus data is more accurate. Hopefully it is. But this is, until there will be a PISA or a PIAC survey that is sample-based, we will not know. Everything is anecdotal. In Israel, we did a survey of a representative sample of students, of middle school students. That was quite surprising, because the press said that kids are unable to connect to distance learning and that gaps are widening because students are not connected. But in the survey, they said that they are on top of it, that they use distance learning for a period of between 1 and 3 hours a day. They said that they hate the Zoom application. And whenever a teacher uses Zoom, what they do at 8:30 in the morning, they open it, they join the group, they close the camera, close the microphone, and go back to sleep. But whenever there is self-learning and group learning and tasks, and teachers operate as facilitators of learning, looking at their difficulties and errors and misconceptions, and intervening when problems occur, then it's fun and games. So I will share with you, I have probably an English version of this survey as well, for both students and teachers in Israel. And it was quite surprising, because the press in Israel said that teachers are not teaching. But at least when they were asking a survey, it was a very, very different environment.
Another question that got asked was whether anyone who was in the survey felt that the quality of learning actually improved during this period.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it awaits you guys around the screens here, because it requires deep research. It makes sense that there are students that get lost in a crowded classroom and flourish when online learning. We know it from various programs, online programs that were in place even before the coronavirus. We saw kids that, well, they don't come in one measure. They learn differently. We all know it. Some of them are very happy with frontal classroom-based teaching, and some of them are bored with it, many of them. And others, whenever you give them responsibility and they can self-regulate their learning, they do very well. Whereas there are many that were disconnected during this time of distance learning. This is why the coming few months, at the early days or the early months of the next school year, will be devoted in many countries, and hopefully in Israel as well, to reassessment of learning. The kids that will come back are very different from those that we remember. Some of them are far ahead. Some of them, their parents work with them on their reading and writing, and they will come back excelling in their grades, and others will lag behind. This is why we have teachers.
I think that one of the things we can actually conclude from this is that of all of the, not only research, but just the number of articles that got written, everybody can find whatever they want to prove through some way that somebody has said something about what happened during this period. We can quote the pupils who said, "Oh, it was so great," and there's pupils who said, "I didn't come in." And of course, research can prove whatever it wants to by handpicking what we want, though that, of course, isn't exactly the objective. I wanted to note here that Morag Messenger says that Morag, I don't know who we is, but there's intention to research what the pupils thought. And I think it's interesting to note what Aviva put in the chat was that what we seem to be learning here is that educational systems are having to change their focus from academic targets to social emotional needs. And it seems to me that we have seen that happening. So thank you for that.
Can I just, because you made some comments, so I would offer some of mine.
Please.
In every crisis, but this one is very typical in that manner as well. We are always persuaded of our own beliefs. So if we believed in SEL before, we always say that the coronavirus pandemic proved that, open quotes, whatever I said. So yes, I agree with your cynicism.
Wasn't necessarily cynicism, but I understand, yes. Okay, Liat, I think that those are the questions. Roxana Rack also notes that apparently from Gordon, they're doing comparative study looking into this in both Israel and Romania. And as Matilda has now also added in, that education has always been more than just knowledge. If only that were always true in the eyes of the administrators, but yes, it's not my job to be cynical at the moment.
I'd also like to add that according to research, we know that in order for teachers to be able to teach in an emotional, social learning, they also need to have their own social emotional learning and support. And I think that in Israel, we've seen a bombardment of criticism on teachers. And I do hope that the recent decision for them to go to vacation allows for some recuperation from that. So thank you very much, Eli. And I would like now to invite our second speaker,